So here are some of the bottles that made my top 10 whiskeys of the year. But today we're going to talk about some of the bottles that just missed the cut. And there's one bottle on this list that I'm literally just lost at words, and I am absolutely heartbroken that it did not make the cut. But let's go ahead and jump to and find out what it is. Welcome back to the Bourbon Retriever, and today we're talking about the bottles that didn't quite make the cut for my top 10 whiskeys of the year. This includes some bottles that didn't make it into the blind, and at the end I'm going to talk about the bottles that ended up making it to the blind but just did not make that top 10 cut. This year I made my blind a little smaller. Last year I did 22 bottles, and personally that was just almost a little too much to try and knock out in one day. This year I made a cut. I got it down to 15 bottles. But there were a lot of bottles I thought were worthy that should have made it in the blind. But when you're trying to process of elimination of what bottles should get in the blind, getting towards the end there was a very difficult decision. But some of these bottles I wanted to highlight and just talk about how much I enjoyed them through the year. But first, I'm going to talk about some of the LE bottles from the major distilleries that typically are hitters, but for me this year they just missed a mark. And the first one we're talking about is the Parker's Heritage. The straight malt whiskey that was finished in cognac barrels. To me, I love the Parker's Heritage series. It's some of the best whiskey that comes out of Heaven Hill every year. But this year, it just was not my jam. And I think it's just because of the components that are in it. I'm not a malt whiskey fan. I'm also not a big finish fan. And so this being finished in cognac, I just don't think this is the whiskey that was meant for me. But if you are a cognac drinker, or a person that loves malt, this might have been the whiskey for you and could have been your top 10 whiskey, but for me personally, I just don't think the whiskey was made for me. Another whiskey from one of the leg distilleries this year was the Four Roses LE from 2024. I think the issue with this whiskey was it was just following a hitter. The 2023 LE was absolutely fantastic. It was one of my top 10 whiskeys of the year last year. I just fell in love with it. It had super old Four Roses juice in there. It had a nice oak presence. However, this year's, it was a fine whiskey. I think if you poured it for someone, they would enjoy it. I just don't think it lives up to the limited edition title that Four Roses carries for their bottles. I think, it would be a really good almost single barrel if you put it up against some of their single barrels. I think it would beat all those. But it just, to me, it just did not quite hit the mark that those bottles, the standard that those bottles should live up to. And then the last leg distillery bottle, Ellie, we're going to talk about is the Maker's Mark Cellar Age 2024. Now this is the oldest Maker's Mark release I think they've ever done. See here, I think it has on the edge here. Yeah, it's 13 and 12-year-old whiskey. Last year's was a year younger, but I actually enjoyed last year's whiskey more. To me, this one is too oak forward and almost smells like a bitter oak. Like a lot of people describe the Elijah Craig 18s as being too oak forward, and I get a lot of those same notes on the Maker's Mark release from 2024. Now I know some of the Maker's Mark fanboys out there did love this bottle. For me personally, it just did not have the complexity that I look for at whiskeys of the year, and that bitter oak finish on it just was a little too much for me. Before I get onto the next bottle on this list, if you're enjoying this content and want to see more like it, hit that subscribe button. That way you don't miss any of my videos that come out in the future. Like later this week, I'm actually putting out my top 10 bourbons of the year. There are some fantastic bottles on that list, including I think 3 bottles that I haven't seen on anyone's list this year. Okay, the next category of bottles that I didn't include on my list this year, but I may include in my list going forward, and they are barrel picks that I did this year. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof that I helped pick out. I love this bottle, especially the sticker that we had on this. The channel here, the Bourbon Retriever, is named after my golden retriever puppy that is now a little over 2 years old. And I just love how we were able to get a golden on here. We talked about Stumpy's Last Stand, which is an iconic cherry tree here in the DC area that is no longer more. But I didn't include these bottles on the list because they are my picks. I was a little worried there might be some bias on there, but it is a blind, and I would love to see how my picks stack up to some of the best whiskeys of the year. I always talk about how barrel picks are some of the best value whiskeys you can find in the game right now, and it's because local stores pick barrels based on their flavor profile. And if you can find these barrel picks, which are a fraction of the cost of these LE bottles, and you can find a store that lines up with your palate, you're gonna find bottles that drastically outbeat limited edition bottles because they're more aligned to the flavor profiles that you like. But I'm really excited for what 2025 has in hold. I'm gonna be a part of some amazing barrel pick teams this year. If you're interested in following along, join my Discord. There's a special channel there where I'll put out information on barrel picks coming out in the future. The next two bottles I'm gonna discuss together, and it is because they come from the same distillery, specifically the Russell's 10, the laser code LLME that people were going on and on about because of a Rare Bird post, and the Wild Turkey 70th anniversary tribute to Jimmy Russell. So the Wild Turkey 70th edition for Jimmy Russell, I thought this was a fine whiskey, but if you take the label off the front of it and don't mention anything about being a release for Jimmy Russell's 70th anniversary, I think the whiskey inside of it is okay. To me, it's very similar to just a really good Kentucky Spirit, and those sit on the shelf in this area for $60. This was, I want to say it was like 50 bucks. So it's kind of roughly in that same area. So while it's a really cool tribute bottle to Jimmy Russell and the history that he has at Wild Turkey, to me it just didn't live up to the quality of juice that you'd expect to have at an end of year blind. However, unlike the Jimmy Russell 70th anniversary, this Russell's 10, specifically the LLME, was fantastic juice. This is a bottle I really wanted in my end of the year blind, it just didn't quite make the cut. I love the aroma on it. It reminds me of some of the older Wild Turkey barrels. Now the backstory on this bottle, I'm sure you've heard of it. I have a video if you want to go check it out discussing the backstory on it, but Rare Bird released a post. He tasted this bottle and fell in love with it and told his followers to go out and buy it. He hypothesized that they were using older barrels in it, specifically Russell's 15 reject barrels, because this was bottled around the same time that Russell's 15 was bottled. However, that has been, I would say, debunked at this point. Wild Turkey did mention, though, that they did use older barrels in this, but it's just not the Wild Turkey 15 reject barrels people were going crazy over. But regardless of all of that backstory and history, this is a great batch of Russell's 10. Again, like I said earlier, the aroma is spot on. I love it, but the taste on it is where it was lacking. Again, I really enjoyed this pour. It was hard for me to crack it into the top 15 blind taste test for this year. But the fact that it didn't make the list, I just don't want to take away from how good of a bottle this was this year. The next two bottles are also from same distillery, and this time we're talking about Bardstown. We're going to talk about Bardstown, the wheated mash bill from their shelf-stable lines, and the Discovery 12 that came out this year. First, let's talk about the Discovery 12. If you don't know about Bardstown, they do Discovery releases. Typically, it's about twice a year, a spring and a fall release. On the side, they have a breakdown of all the different components that went into it, and historically, the 11 and 12 have had some older age legacy whiskey into it. Some of the past batches didn't quite have that, but they're coming back to these light distilleries, and I hope they continue that going forward because 11 and 12 were fantastic. But when you're coming to the end of the year whiskey list, you have to be slightly more critical. And when I was drinking this whiskey, I loved the experience, but it was just a little flat. Not like flat like a bad whiskey, but just wasn't punching up to the weight of a top 10 whiskey. The notes there were fine, they were great, I enjoyed them, but they just weren't pronounced or strong enough to overset some of the whiskeys that made it into the top 15. But I am excited to follow along with the Discovery series. I will buy the next one if it keeps the same type of components, the age statement on them. But I am excited for the future of it because eventually they're gonna start putting a lot of their own juice into the blend. And as it ages and get older, I think those blends could be absolutely amazing. But let's go ahead and jump into some of the products they are putting out themselves, their own distillate. And this one is their wheated mash bill. It just came out this year. It's the newest addition to their kind of stable core products. And I think if I did a best whiskey of the year shelf stable products, this one would be the winner. One of the best values in the game. For me, around here, I'm able to get it for about $40, which is just absolutely killer. It has that great proof point of 107 proof, right in that wheelhouse. Not too hot, not too watery. So while I don't think the whiskey inside the wheated Bardstown would be top 15 whiskey, I almost put in the blind just to see where an everyday shelfer would fall. just because it'd be a bottle that I think most people could go out in their shelves in their local area and find. And if the bottle beat some of these Ellies that are twice the price, I think that'd be really cool. But at the end of the day, I just didn't think drinking them side by side that it lived up to the quality of those other juice. But blinds are really the only way to do that. So maybe in the future, I'll do some side by sides with this with other Ellie blinds just to see how it's stacked up. If you see this weeder on your shelf in your local area, anywhere under 50 bucks, just buy it. This is one of the best shelf releases that came out this year. So the next bottle we're gonna talk about is a collaboration that Bourbon Lore did with Ben Holiday. This came out towards the beginning of this year, and it was a harder bottle to get. Once they posted it online, I think it sold out pretty quickly, definitely sold out within the day. But I absolutely love this bottle. This was a great project they did. I haven't had any of the other Bourbon Lore projects. I know they did like a Bardstown blend. They might have done a couple others, but what's holding me back is the price tag on them. I know they're doing great projects, but the price tag on them is just holding me back a little bit from buying the future releases. But focusing back on the Ben Holiday, this is probably the best Ben Holiday that I've had. I thought this was a great release, really enjoyed it. But again, at the end of the day, it was just a tough cut to make the top 15, and this one's just one of the ones on the outside looking in. So the next bottle is a bottle that I love to try and put in my end of the year blinds every year, but this year's didn't quite live up to my expectations, and that is the Stag Junior. This one specifically is 24B. I know people have said some good things about the 24A, and I know the 24C has recently come out, but I haven't really heard much on that yet. But I personally had the 24B, and to me it was just a little too sweet. If you love sweet whiskey, this is be right up your jam. It might be your favorite batch. But for me, I look for some of those darker, richer caramel notes, a little bit of more oak char to it. Whereas instead, this one was more just a nice, sweet, simple syrup. Whereas the Stag Junior batches that I enjoy much more are more well-rounded. They have all those aspects to make it a more just balanced drinking experience. Whereas this one to me was just really one-noted, and it just didn't have any of those other aspects of a great Stag Junior batch that I look for. But at the end of the day, these are $50, $60. So if you get any Stag Junior, you're having a good day. I will never pass one of these down. I love these bottles. I still enjoyed this bottle. It's just, you know, we're talking about the best whiskies of the year. It just did not quite make the cut. Another bottle that I really wanted to include in this list year, but just ran out of space, was 1924 from Old Forester. This was released this year. I think they're looking to release it every year around January, February, so batch 2 should be coming out shortly. And I loved the aroma on the 1924. I think it smelled fantastic. Where it just did not live up to the rest of the whiskeys is the palate. It's just a little lacking in that front, but I really did want to include it in the blind because it has done pretty well in other blinds that I've done. So I think it's a whiskey that by itself might seem underwhelming, but when you put it up to other whiskeys, they can just dominate blinds. I ran out of space this year and wasn't able to include it. So the next 4 bottles are bottles that went into the end of the year blind. They made the cut, but after doing the blind, they just weren't able to make it into the top 10. And the bottle that came in last place is the Penelope Estate Collection. This is the 9-year. So one qualifier I will say about this bottle going into the blind was it was a fresh crack, whereas every other bottle that went into the blind had been open for a good amount of time. So maybe if this one had some more air into it, had been open longer, it would have done well in the blind. I've had this in the past, in previous blinds, it did well. I love this bottle. It's just almost exactly what I would want Buffalo Trace products to be. It has a nice, rich sweetness to it, balancing out with the oak a little bit in the background there. It is just a great sit down, drink it, enjoy it. It isn't overly complex, and I think that's, at the end of the day, what kind of killed it here. It was an enjoyable drink. Nothing in the blinds that I had were bad. It's just when you stack it up to the other whiskeys, it just didn't have the complexities or the prominence of notes that the other whiskeys in the blind had. Now the next bottle on this list probably had the opposite effect of the Penelope, and it is the Heaven Hill 18, and it is because this bottle, as you can see, has been almost killed. So having too much air in a bottle can almost have the same effect as having almost not enough air in the bottle. This again was a great whiskey, enjoyed it, but it just came up flat. It had a little bit of spicy notes to it that I enjoyed, had the nice Heaven Hill, Elijah Craig, barrel proof notes you get, but it just, when you're making cuts here, it can be very difficult. I had high hopes for this bottle when it first came out. It's an 18-year Elijah Craig, 120 proof whiskey. The 17 came out 3 years ago, and that was a phenomenal whiskey by all reports. I personally haven't had it, but everyone just gave great reviews about it. So when 18 came out, I was super excited to get it. Was able to get it in one of the ABC drops. I cannot tell you how happy I was that day. But drinking through this, when I first opened it, it was okay. After it got a lot of air into it though, it was fantastic. Loved it. But now that it's gotten towards the bottom here, I think just a little too much air has gotten in there and has just negatively impacted the drinking experience. So this next bottle is a bottle I chase every year. I try and get this one if I can, and it is the Michter's 10 Bourbon. The last 2 years, the 23A, phenomenal. This is a 24A, absolutely phenomenal when I opened it. Drink through it. I love drinking this every time I can. The aroma on it is absolutely fantastic. I enjoy it every time that I have it. What lacks on the Michter's 10 Bourbon is the drinking experience. It's a great drinking experience. I enjoy it. Again, it just didn't stand up to the other whiskeys. It's a little more muted. You know, this is a lower proof whiskey. That might be the impact of it. When you drink lower proof whiskeys next to higher proof whiskeys, they can just be overshadowed with the amount of flavor those higher proof whiskeys are putting out. Now, if this bottle was in a blind with all whiskeys that were under 100 proof, I think it would have done much better. And I will still be hunting these every year. I think these are great, I don't want to say values because they are expensive at $180 for a 10-year whiskey, but I really enjoy this whiskey and it will be a bottle that I try and get every year. Okay, we are now on to the final bottle that did not make the top 10 of the year. And this is the bottle that is just gut-wrenching to me. And it is none other than the Old Fitz 13-year, the VVS. To me, this was probably gonna be top 3 whiskey of the year going into the blind. The aroma on this is special. For you that don't know the history in this bottle, I made a video up here, check it out if you're interested. But the quick backstory is the Heaven Hill distillery burned down in 1996, somewhere around there, and they had to get a new distillery, so they went and purchased the old Birnheim distillery. And this was some of the first juice distilled at that distillery. After 13 years in the barrel, they tasted it, fell in love with the product, but they wanted to stop the aging process because they thought it was a perfect whiskey in that moment. So they dumped them in totes to stop that aging process. And this is just a really cool whiskey because this is probably as close as you're gonna get to tasting how whiskey tasted back in 1999 without having the worry of any taint. A lot of times when you're buying or tasting dusty bottles, you don't know how that bottle was stored, how long it's been open, has it been in heat, sunlight. There's many different things that can affect the taste of the whiskey. But this bottle was stored at Heaven Hill Distillery, probably in almost the most pristine conditions that you can store dusty whiskey. And I just fell in love with this bottle because of the backstory on it. I don't think we're gonna find many whiskeys like this going forward. I have a hard time believing these legacy distilleries have totes of dusty whiskey laying around. I feel like this has to just be a one-off, and it's just gonna be really hard to replicate going forward. But getting back to the whiskey itself, the juice inside the bottle, behind this backstory, the aroma on it, I would probably say is a top 5 aroma. It is absolutely magnificent, and mostly just to help educate people on what dusty whiskey smells like. However, the palate on it is extremely lackluster. It tastes just like a shelf-stable whiskey. There's nothing amazing about it, nothing to write home. If you take the aroma out of it, it's probably maybe like a $50 whiskey. It tastes fine. A little bit, maybe astringency with some proof there in the back end, but it's a fine whiskey. But the aroma on it is just amazing. I think the major takeaway for this bottle for people is that dusty whiskey is not always better whiskey. It's just a different drinking experience. And I think I fell in love with this bottle because of the story behind it, being able to drink that history. And it was just a really cool experience in that moment. However, when you put dusty whiskey in blinds with whiskey made today, it just doesn't always stand up. So that's my list of bottles that did not make the top 10 this year. But before you head up here during this content, check out this video or this one. And until next time, cheers.